In this video, I'll give you an overview of the personality typology systems that were inspired by Carl Jung's work, namely the MBTI, or Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, and Socionics, as part of my personality framework series. I'll cover the basics of these systems, their strengths and weaknesses, and give you a couple of resources to look up if you'd like to learn more. So I'll start by addressing right off the bat that these systems have a pretty controversial status. If you check them out on Wikipedia, on the very first sentence, you'll read something like, well, basically it'll say that they're pseudoscientific. I don't remember the exact wording, but so there's a lot of criticism that is directed their way, we'll say. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And furthermore, this video will most likely be pretty long because I've got a lot of things to talk about. And it's probably a good idea to make a bit of a case for why you might be interested in Jungian typology in the first place. So I thought I'd share my personal story with it quickly before diving into the more technical, matter-of-fact overview of the theory itself. So at some point, I got pretty interested in the big five personality traits that I covered in a previous video. And I wanted to do the test to see where I rated on those 5 traits. But I wasn't aware of any online test at that time, at that point in time. And I just remember vaguely a test I had done called 16 Personalities, which is basically an MBTI-inspired test that has very similar traits. And so I thought, oh, maybe I'll try this one and it will kind of give me some indication of where I fall on the big 5 traits. And so, I did the test and I got my answer, I got my profile. And, I was reading the profile description. Some of it seemed pretty accurate, but I was, kind of curious, how could they know so much information? How could they kind of list all these things about my personality when all I had done was, just rated on a Likert scale from do I very much agree or very much disagree with a list of statements. So it seemed weird how much they could infer about me from what seemed to be fairly little information. And if you do an actual Big 5 test, it won't give you that much information about your personality besides how you score on the traits, right? So if you scored very extroverted, it will tell you, well, you're very extroverted, but it won't make other more complicated claims about your personality or the way you think about things or you act. So, that got me curious, and there was enough matching information, we'll say, with stuff that seemed accurate that I was curious enough. So I started looking up some forums, I think subreddits, and I started, seeing the term of cognitive functions pop up and up again and again, and which seemed to be a big part of the whole systems, but I didn't know anything about them. So I wanted to learn more about that because that seemed potentially interesting. And I think that's how I ended up on the blog Personality Junkie by AJ Drentz. And I think he has some good posts that explain the basics of the theory, including the cognitive functions. And I think by reading the blog, I got pretty invested and thought it was good quality. And somehow I stumbled upon his books. So he had 2 books that are dedicated solely to the personality type I got, which, the one I'm associated to in the systems. And so I don't remember exactly why, but I guess the copy must have been compelling enough, and they're not very expensive. So I decided to buy them, and I read them. And so, it delves in pretty much details. I mean, they're fairly short books, but there's still 2 books, it's like it would take you probably, at least it would take me, and I'm a pretty fast reader, probably about a day, maybe a little bit less than a day to read both of these back to back. So there's still a decent amount of words in there, and it described some of my behaviors, but also some of the inner thought process and motivations behind those behaviors, including some that may be like hidden to outside people, and including some some parts were describe strengths or good things you want to hear about yourself, but some not so much. Some were pretty unsavory, or like, well, it's not so great. It also both of these books kind of list different philosophies that my type, which is the INTP, would be likely to appreciate or believe in or ascribe to. And but basically a lot of information, and much of it very accurate, about me, that no one else really, or that some of it I was aware of, some I was like, oh, if I think about it, that's true. But most of it aren't things that would have been readily apparent to other people, or that people would have commented about me. And so like it felt like there was like some kind of NSA spyware inside my brain that this person had access to. And so like that kind of had an impact on me. It convinced me that there's some real stuff to this MBTI thing, based on those two books that have like a lot of valuable information. And with the amount of content in those books, it can't just be the Barnum effect, or it's a more complicated version. So that's one of the criticisms that's made to personality types, is the Barnum effect, where we tend to overestimate how well a basically very generic statement applies to us as a person. But usually these claims are pretty vague, and pretty general, and they apply to most people, right? That's kind of how it works. But then you think it's really about you, when in fact it's about everyone. But the Barnum effect works less good if you have a lot of information, and some of it is pretty divisive, as in, some people will definitely not relate with that. For example, I mean, that's not really the type of personality traits you'd see, right? But like if you said, this person, or this profile, loves heavy metal, like a lot of people are going to be, that's not me. So those types of claims are harder to get Barnum effect by. And also, a lot of some of this information was not necessarily, it didn't make me look good or so, because one part of the Barnum effect is that it kind of plays into like seeking some praise and validation, and that's also something that can happen with personality typology, one of the potential flaws. But so most of it seemed to be mitigated by just the sheer amount of information, and like a lot of guesses, which seemed like risky guesses to make, that all turned out to be pretty accurate. So as the quote from Django Unchained goes, I saw, gentlemen, you had my curiosity, but now you have my attention. So I kept engaging with the theory and enriching my understanding of it across time. And then more recently, that was several years ago, more recently, I had dabbled a little bit in Socionics, but always ended up kind of, stopping, because it's a pretty complex system. But then I finally found a series on YouTube that described it in a way I liked, and I've come to find it to be a superior system to the Myers-Briggs type indicator, although I still have fondness for it later. But overall, I would say that these systems have enriched my conceptual toolkit for thinking about personality and the different types of approaches and preferences that people have when they engage with reality, kind of some of their philosophical preferences. And also, it's just been a lot of fun to think through and about these systems in general. So that's why I think it's worth it to, just dabble with them. You don't have to like them. And if you think that the flaws outweigh the benefits, then you don't have to partake in the whole thing. But I just want to kind of share my journey. Okay. So with that being said, let's move on to the actual overview. I'll also mention some of the flaws and pseudoscientific stuff at the strengths and weakness section. But let's start with what is Jungian personality typology. So this whole series, this whole kind of line of thinking or lineage of thought is based on Jung's observations in his book called Personality Types that he published in 1921. He basically listed a couple of dichotomies that make up personality, but you could even say consciousness to an extent. So the first most important dichotomy that you definitely have already heard about are the dichotomy itself could be called attitude, and it can either be extroverted or introverted. So extraversion, introversion, very popular concepts by now. In the Jungian definition, we'll say extroversion is kind of an orientation that's more focused on external objects and the environment, whereas introversion is more oriented towards the inner psyche, the subjective, and the subject. So that's the first important dichotomy, attitude. And then he has other dichotomies in what he called psychological functions. So basically, you can think of them as way of interacting with the world. And so there's two, there's one, well, they're divided in the judging functions and the perceiving functions, and then there's two of each. So judging cognitive functions, which are also known as rational in his system. I don't really like that term because I feel it's not, it leads to confusion. But basically, they're prescriptive functions, and then they make decisions, they make judgment calls. Right? It's kind of restraining options and saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do. That's what these type of functions we use them for, we'll say. And then the perceiving functions, which are named also as irrational in the system. Again, I'm not a big fan of this name, but they're basically descriptive or functions which are more about observing reality and gathering data. So he splits, or the judging dichotomy is split between feeling and thinking. So feeling is about subjective values, attitudes, and reactions, whereas thinking is more about logical laws and connections. And then for the perceiving side of things, we have intuition, which is about invisible mental association and concepts and abstractions. And then sensation, which is more just linked to physiological stimulus and sense data. So we've got those. We've got this first dichotomy of attitude with extroversion and introversion. And then we've got two types of functions, judging and perceiving. And within each of those, we have a dichotomy, feeling and thinking, and intuition and sensation. On this basis, Jung derives psychological types, which are also known as cognitive functions in the Myers-Briggs system, or information elements in Socionics. Okay, so one thing with this video is you'll probably, if you've never heard about those before, you'll probably get a little lost in the jargon. It's fine. There's like a lot of specific terms, and they vary between the systems, but I'll just mostly talk about them as cognitive functions because that's what I'm most used to. But so the cognitive functions are made up of each of the dichotomies we spoke before. So the feeling, thinking, intuition, and sensation paired with an attitude. So extroverted or introverted. And thus we get 8 functions. We have extroverted feeling and introverted feeling, extroverted thinking and introverted thinking, extroverted intuition and introverted intuition, and lastly, extroverted sensing or sensation and introverted sensing. So in order to kind of symbolize each of these functions, there is there's like a little one-letter symbol for each of them. So the extroverted attitude dichotomy has its own symbol. So in order to signify extroversion, we use the letter E. Introversion is symbolized by the letter I. And then feeling is symbolized by F, thinking by T. So far so good, it's just the first letter. Intuition is the one exception because we already have introversion with I that's using that symbol. So instead, intuition uses N as a symbol. And then sensing uses S. And so basically the way those functions are symbolized is you use one of those function letters and you pair it with an attitude letter symbol, right? So extroverted feeling is F with usually capitalized F and then lowercase e. And then introverted feeling would be Fi. Extroverted thinking is Te. Introverted thinking is Ti. Extroverted intuition is Ne. Introverted intuition is Ni. And then extroverted sensing is Se. And lastly, introverted sensing is Si. Okay, so these are the little symbol that represent them. So, and I'll probably refer to them under those names. And if you delve into the theory, you'll find them a lot. So that's why I listed those. And basically, you can think of each of these cognitive functions as the atomic components of personality, or like the Lego blocks, that when arranged together, form personality. So I'll very briefly try to describe each of these cognitive functions. But there's a lot to cover. So if you're interested in that, you should look for more in-depth descriptions. And also, there are some differences of interpretation between different systems. So although they're mostly compatible, there's some little differences between how MBTI describes those functions versus the Socionics. But so if we take feeling, it's all about attitudes, how you feel about something, likes and dislikes, and the moods. And so extroverted feeling is more attuned to the general feelings of people, like in the environment. So mood, and kind of being receptive to the general mood of people and influencing this general mood and harmonizing it. Whereas introverted feeling is more attuned to personal attitudes and feeling and likes and dislikes, and being authentic about those. When we move on to thinking, which is all about kind of logical connections, we have extroverted thinking, so TE, which is more focused on external sources for logic, so kind of data gathering and comparison, and external forms of coming up to conclusions. Whereas TI, introverted thinking, is more about just pure logic and kind of deriving deductively from first principles without really much need for external data. So that's thinking. And then moving on to intuition, which is about kind of ideas. You have extroverted intuition, which is more about possibilities, kind of all the potential ideas, and their potential. And then introverted thinking, which is more about kind of important trends, or like the most important idea, or the biggest mover, so to speak. And extroverted thinking tends to be more divergent and more like connective in all the potentialities and how they are interconnect. Whereas in introverted thinking, NI is more convergent and finding like the big points in commons, or the underlying biggest central ideas, so to speak. And then we have sensing, so which is all about sense data, interacting with the environment, and kind of like the receptivity about to external objects, and also exerting influence on it, and the influence they exert on us. And so extroverted sensing is more about external objects and how to influence them, and introverted sensing is more about inner reactions to external objects. So kind of how do you internally react to those, or your subjective relationship to external objects. So that was a brief description. You probably won't remember all of it, but just to give you a general idea, and if you want to deep dive, then you can do so, and I'll give you plenty of resources. So now we have all our 8 cognitive functions, and these functions come in pairs. There's basically like polarities, and that's all still part of Jung's theory. The idea is basically you have one main function which is conscious, and it's in a polarity with another function which is more repressed and unconscious. And so the way those polarities work is that they belong to the same dichotomy. So a judging function will be with another judging function. So basically, feeling functions will be paired with thinking functions, and conversely. And then the perception function will be interconnected one with the other. So intuition will be an intuition functions will be connected with the sensation functions within these axes. And lastly, they have opposing attitudes. So basically, one will be introverted and the other is extroverted. And so we get 4 of these pairs or axes. We'll have extroverted feeling, which is a judging function. So it'll be paired with thinking. And since it's extroverted feeling, the thinking will be introverted. And so we have the extroverted feeling, introverted thinking pair. Then we have the introverted feeling, extroverted thinking pair. And for perception, it's extroverted intuition with introverted sensing, and introverted intuition with extroverted sensing. So that's kind of the general concept that were brought forth by Jung. And then on this basis, a more structured system or more detailed systems were built and created more personalities, because Jung was mostly focused on these cognitive functions, and basically in his views every person was mostly influenced or had like this one main big cognitive function that defined their personality, whereas the following systems that were inspired by it create 16 personalities with more detailed inner workings of how all of this is interconnected. So the first is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which was created by an American mother and daughter during World War II. And it was kind of more influenced in this Western sphere because it's not just them. So they created this test that would create those 16 personalities. But in order to build the test, it's based under a theory. And when I talk about the MBTI, I'm really talking about the theory that make it up, rather than the specific official test. And then a lot of other writers and theorists kind of added their own spin to it. And then you have Socionics, which came later in the 70s and 80s and was developed in Lithuania by, and I have no idea how to properly pronounce her name, but Audra Augustinavičiūtė. I hope I did this half decently. And she basically mixed Jung's theory with the information metabolism theory by Antoni Kempinski, which was Polish. And so basically Socionics came a little bit later, and it's more influenced by Eastern European thinkers. And there are some differences. Myers-Briggs tend to be more focused on preferences. So basically, each type has preferences for specific cognitive functions. Whereas because Socionics is inspired by information metabolism, it's more focused on people's ability to process and manipulate types of information, although there's also, whereas it tends to be a little bit more specific, there's also concepts of being strong at processing some information, also valuing some forms of information and not valuing others. Both of these systems order functions, and this ordering is what creates a type. And so again, this ordering has a different name in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, or the MBTI. It's called the function stack. In Socionics, it's called Model A. But basically, the general idea is you can think of it as like a little psychic cabinet with an ordering of cognitive functions that produce different effects. Another analogy would be, you've got those 8 notes, which are the cognitive functions. You've got a couple of rules on how they can be arranged with one another. And based on these 8 notes and rules, you can create 16 possible different combinations or melodies. Or another analogy would be you have like this puzzle board, and you have 8 interconnected pieces that create 4 axes and can be assembled on a board to portray 16 different pictures. And so kind of some of the rules and what each order, because basically each spot in this little psychic cabinet has different properties. Based on mixing your cognitive function with the specific spot it is in this little psychic cabinet, that's how you derive all this information about a person's type. And that's how you can, well, based on a simple test, but which is really powered by this theory, you can derive a lot of information and write, pages and pages on what seems to be very little information at first. So there's a couple of differences in the MBTI and the Socionics. I won't be exhaustive, but basically in the MBTI, this cognitive stack, or this little cabinet, is made up of only 4 functions. And then the other 8 are not, well, it depends. There's a sub-theory within the MBTI about what's going on with those. But in Socionics, it's more homogeneous, the way people think about it. And basically, there is 8, you use the 8 functions in the stack, like the little cabinet's got the 8 spots for all functions. As I said, there are a couple of differences in how the MBTI and Socionics define the cognitive functions. The greatest difference is for extroverted sensing, whereas the MBTI is really more about being kind of attuned to the external environment and being, basically it's got a bit of a hedonist side to it, kind of like, being in these sensations, pursuing new sensations, and kind of this kind of sensual interaction with the environment. Whereas in Socionics, it's more about tactics and seeing how one object will affect another object, and this includes people too, and kind of how to exerting power in a certain way and accumulating possessions. So that's pretty different. There's also a couple of differences in the definitions for TE, or extroverted thinking, and introverted sensing, but overall they're still pretty similar. Lastly, as I said, for the MBTI, part of the name is type indicator. The type indicator is a test, and that's kind of a lot of the official MBTI stuff is about this test. Basically, the idea is the test is perfect, and through taking the test, you'll know your type. And then one thing I don't really like is that the official MBTI information, and it's the same on 16 personalities, although it's it's not official MBTI, but they don't talk about the underlying functions at all. They just kind of cover them up. It's just like this, how that's what they use to build the profiles, but they just don't really mention them, which I think is a shame. Whereas Socionics, and so and the MBTI is really focused on these dichotomies or preferences for example, a type preferring intuition over sensation, or thinking over feeling, etc. Socionics is more complicated. It's got a lot more rules, but in doing so, it's also more rigorous and consistent in its definitions, which is definitely pretty nice. So that will cover for the most part, how the system works, or how the system works. This is just an overview. I can't, like, if I was trying to be exhaustive, this would take forever. And so now I'll move on to strengths and weaknesses. So in terms of strengths, I think that these systems have a lot of potential they can be very rich, dense, and nuanced. Part of Jungian typology is that it's not just about describing what you can see from people's behavior or comparing them to other people. It's also trying to explain what's going on inside, what's motivating things. And that's kind of a risky endeavor to do, right? Because you can get things wrong, or you can kind of pull things out of thin air, which aren't really true. But if you do get it right, then there's a lot of potential for much more insight than just a simple description. Another thing that the Jungian typology is very good at, in my opinion, is explaining the psychology behind philosophical proclivities, you could say, or psycho-epistemology. But basically, it's good at breaking down some of the inner mechanics of subjectivity. And so when I'm saying about, philosophical proclivities, I'm being very literal. So, it can kind of explain or connect pretty significantly with preference for example, rationalism versus empiricism in the areas of epistemology, but also of, in a similar vein, materialism versus idealism, for example, or, favoring a form of skeptical, open-minded exploration in contrast to a search for the unchanging truth. And, even that you could associate with, for example, the postmodern philosophies versus the more, for example, Christian or more moral truth, moral objectivity, and so on and so forth. So that's very interesting to me. And there's also this idea that basically each function has kind of its own agenda and preferred perspectives and framings. And so thinking through those functions can offer lots of insights and way of thinking about things, or why and how people come to see things in different ways, or prefer certain ways of thinking, or engaging with the environment. And in my opinion, so other systems do this too, but in my opinion, the Jungian inspired systems are the best at this. Another thing I like about these systems is that they're built on dichotomies. Now, that's maybe not very exciting for everyone, but this means that these are very structured systems, especially Socionics, where basically you need to accept a couple of somewhat arbitrary initial assumptions, like basically that there is such a thing as these dichotomies of introversion, extroversion, thinking, feeling, etc. But if you accept kind of those initial premises, then everything is derived deductively from those. So all arbitrariness is contained at the level of the axioms, and whereas the rest follows logically. And that's something I like, because a lot of personality frameworks out there have a lot of arbitrariness. Not only will they be, okay, so there's this type, and this type, and this type is like this. Why? No explanation. This type is like this, just take it at my word. The Jungian typology systems don't do this. Once you've accepted the initial dichotomies, then everything just kind of falls into place. Lastly, another thing I enjoy about them is that they're not just opaque types. You get to understand the inner mechanics. Okay, you can see under the hood. That's what's so interesting. And it's not either a plain average trait score like the big five, where it's just like, you're right there compared to other people. Which is okay. Well, that's kind of interesting, but so what? Here, it offers you valuable conceptual tools to play around with. You can think about personality in a granular way at the level of the cognitive functions, and compare strategies between them. So like there'll be some differences between the extroverted and introverted approaches to the same functions. So comparing introverted thinking with extroverted thinking, introverted feeling with extroverted feeling, etc. But also you can think about the different approaches to the same attitude, but different side of the dichotomies. So for example, within judgment, introverted thinking versus introverted feeling, and this whole aspect of kind of what I call personality Lego blocks, or fundamental particles, in a similar way to, or metaphorically somewhat similar to Mendeleev's periodic table. That's really interesting. And then there's also polarities and tensions. As I said, you've got all of these functions are associated into pairs or axes. So there's kind of a tug of war between two polarities on both sides that are kind of competing, that kind of form a whole, but also are competing with one another. And so that offers a lot of nuance, because whereas a simple averaged out score, on a scale, as you'd have on the big five, would just say, you rate at 65% extroversion, for example, in contrast to the population at large. Well, with the MBTI and its polarities, then it can explain how you're actually torn in between two different opposing kind of motivations or poles, and then you kind of end up with a score in the middle. But it's not because you're just like average man. It's because it's kind of the averaging of the tug of war in between these two sides. So that sums it up for strengths. Moving on to weaknesses. Well, first of all, the whole pseudoscientific thing. So basically, Jung just came up with those dichotomies from noticing patterns in his practice, in his psychological practice, and it's not based on empirical data, right? Like you can't measure, you can't open up someone's psyche with a microscope and see, I can find a cognitive function there. So it's got untestable axioms on this whole series, and so with the current way science works, if you can't test it with experimentally, you can't basically falsify it with empirical proof in one way or the other, then it's unscientific or even pseudoscientific. Which I think unscientific is better. For me, pseudoscientific is pretending to be scientific while not being scientific. And definitely some people that do, that use Jungian typology kind of overplay the scientificity. And in this case, I think it's warranted to call it pseudoscience. But I don't think it's necessarily pseudoscience. Also, although you might not agree with this approach, that you think that everything should be empirically proven and based on things you can see or test, and you shouldn't be creating this kind of speculative systems. That's your right, but I do think that there's differences in between different systems. So I know that sometimes the MBTI is called astrology for business people or nerds, and I think that's not a completely accurate or fair comparison, because astrology is based on axioms, right? The main assumption from astrology is basically that the constellation in the sky at the time of your birth will not only have an influence on your personality, but even on your future, right? Kind of on your destiny, so to speak. And then this is actually something that's testable to an extent. You can actually see people that were born in the same place at the same time and see is there like correlation between their personalities and their life paths. And because if their part of their destiny is written at the moment of their birth, then you'd think that you'd find correlations or points in common in their life. But that does not appear to be the case. So basically, the core assumption behind astrology can be tested somewhat, and so far, every time they've been kind of debunked. So I think it's different with Jungian typology, because Jungian typology, it's kind of a nobody knows exactly. Yeah, so you can say, oh well, there's no proof, so I'll just dismiss it. But it is different, right? It's kind of a matter of whether you think it's kind of interesting or not. There's no clear evidence one way or the other. Although there are other issues. For example, and I mentioned this as my Should You Trust Personality Frameworks video, there is the issue of using personality types. So that's not very popular in psychology because, first of all, people's personality will change over time. And as I stated, most traits, including psychological traits, are distributed on a normal curve. So basically, most people are average in the middle, and then you've got a couple of outliers, whereas types cleave the population in bimodal distributions. So it is like there's 50% of type A and 50% of type B, but that does not map out well with the concept that most people are in the middle. Then it feels like it's pretty arbitrary to kind of create types. So that's a good criticism. I think this is somewhat mitigated by the fact that basically you've got all those cognitive functions which are working at the same time. So basically you get those general preferences, but it's not as simplistic as just like a binary, because everybody has several of, for example, everybody has one of each type of the dichotomies at least with MBTI. So you've got a thinking, a feeling, a sensing, and an intuitive function, right? So everybody has some of everything. It's just ordered differently. Well, it's not completely binary, but still, that's a decent vector of criticism, I'll say. Now, another problem with Jungian personality, especially the MBTI, is when you do not consider the cognitive function. For me, the cognitive function is the whole thing that makes it interesting. If you just use the traits, basically, people are either favor intuition or sensing, or judging or perceiving, or intuition or versus extroversion, that I think is pretty weak. It's just basically like a shittier version of the Big Five model that's missing the neuroticism trait. It's a less reliable test, and then the traits are more interconnected or correlated one with another. So basically there's kind of some overlap between some of the traits, which is not great. I won't go into more details. You can watch the videos on the Big Five and Should You Trust Personality Systems for a bit more information on this front. But yeah, I think that for example, 16 personalities are the official MBTI tests are kind of missed the point in my opinion. And then lastly, there are some risk of rigidity and essentialism, which is one of the downsides of personality frameworks I talked about in the latest video. Or another way to think about this is basically psychological determinism, saying like you're this type and you'll never change, and you're kind of locked in this type. And then if it's not true, that's a big problem, right? You can restrain people's growth. And this is especially the case in Socionics. Socionics makes some pretty bold claim that basically you're good in this area, you suck in this area, but you could get better, and then you suck in this area and you'll never get better, don't even try. So if that's actually true, well, that's important information to have. But if it gets some of it wrong, then it could arbitrarily restrict your self-development, and that'd be a big cost. So that's something to keep in mind, I think. So in conclusion, Jungian typology is based on dichotomies. There's dichotomies everywhere, and granted that you accept the premises, then the rest of the system and profiles just build down deductively, and it all makes sense. I think that it's the most dense and that has the most richness of potential insight. Basically, in terms of generating new ideas or creating new ways of thinking about things, or just being interesting over time, I've liked many systems of personality, And I find, most of them I find have some good insight, actually, at least the biggest ones. But for me, the Jungian types are the one I come to back and the most, and that I find the most interesting to link with other ideas and ways of thinking about things. So it's my personal favorite. Lastly, let's mention where to learn more about the whole thing. So this is what I'd recommend the order you'd follow. Since there's like a lot of components and interactions to learn about for these systems, okay, they're pretty meaty. If you're not motivated or you feel overwhelmed, you will probably give up and not delve deeper. And in my opinion, the best motivation is resonance, right? Finding a strong match, or like, oh, this really describes me well, or this is something I didn't think about. And so starting with doing tests and reading profiles without even learning, the whole system is probably a good way to start, because it depends on how well it resonates. So if you read the profiles or you do the test and you're like, oh, this is not it at all, well, fine. Then you don't need to delve any deeper. With that being said, I think you should start with the MBTI rather than Socionics. Now, some of the Socionics fans will find this to be a very bad idea, because they think that Socionics is more precise, and if you learn MBTI, it's kind of learning how to swim wrong. Then it'll be harder to learn the proper way to do it, so to speak. But personally, I don't think this is such a big deal. Like, I don't think that the MBTI will lead you so badly astray, and it is easier to learn. Like, and a lot of what you'll learn in the MBTI will make it easier to learn Socionics afterwards, even though it will give you some reflexes. For example, I still think of the types, the type names, and the MBTI style rather than the Socionics one. And I like to say cognitive functions rather than information elements, but I don't think that's such a big deal. So the MBTI is easier to understand, and it will give you plenty of familiarity with Jungian typology, and makes Socionics easier to learn. So I think it's probably a good idea to start with it, especially since it's more popular and has a bigger community, and so it's got more resources and it's easier to dip your feet into. Granted, on the downside of that, there's also a lot more bullshit and pretty bad content or surrounding it, but that's just how things go. So first things first, if you want to take the test, which taking tests is fun for most people will go use magazine tests where it's like, are you more of an ice cream cone or a cactus, and then you've got 3 options, and you count the number if you got little triangles or squares, and then if you're an ice cream cone or a cactus, and that's fun for people. And I think that even when it's complete nonsense, it's just kind of fun to do those questionnaires. So here are a couple of options. So 16 personalities is the most welcoming and popular option. It's got those little avatars, which are cute. But it's also the least accurate and the most superficial. It's basically, as I said, when these MBTI tests just type on traits and not cognitive function, and they only talk about traits, is they're just like a shittier version of the Big Five or the Neo-PIR test, for example. So, if you want to get people into it, it's the easiest place of access, but it's also kind of the lowest hanging fruit. So I think that better tests are those that use cognitive function. So you have the Sarkinova test, and my favorite one is Michael Kalla's test. The latter also explains some of the theory. And then also what another thing I like about Michael Kalla's test is that it lists your most likely types. So it doesn't just tell you, oh, you're this one. It says, okay, according to this test, the most likely one is this type, and then it's this one, and then this one, and then this one. You should probably be one of the types that's on the top 3 of the list. So it might get something wrong, especially because a lot of variation happens in how you answer. You can answer more or less truthfully with or without intending it. Although, with that being said, I'd say beware of tests because they're imperfect shortcut tools. Like they can be useful in propelling some of the things. Definitely can help narrow down some types that you're definitely not, and a couple of types that you're probably one of those. But the best way to type yourself is to ponder the theory and kind of figure it out for yourself. That's the best way to do it at the end of the day. I don't know any Socionics test personally, but I think that's fine, because if you start with MBTI, Based on that knowledge and learning Socionics theory, you should be able to type yourself without using a test. So you've got your test results. You kind of have an idea of the most likely 2-3 types you might be. Well, now you need to know if they're actually good matches. So reading or listening about profiles is probably the next step, and seeing if anything resonates. Most test sites will directly route you to a profile page, which is at least like a short, a summary of traits about that type. The Personality Junkie website has some pretty good profile pages. All of the things I'm mentioning, it'll be links in the description. I think Personality Junkie also has a test, but I don't remember if it's any good or not, so I've got no opinion on that front. It's also great books. It's got great books if you happen to be an INTP, and potentially if you're an INFJ, but I didn't read that one, so I can't say for sure. And lastly, Michael Pierce is a YouTube channel. Well, he has a YouTube channel, and he has some very good videos on the topic, and there's a whole YouTube playlist with good types of descriptions. So it's by that point, you're interested enough to start dabbling or delving into the theory. I'd recommend starting with Personality Junkies 101 post series that explains the basics of the MBTI in 3 posts. And then Michael Pierce's videos also are very good. There's a video I made on how to translate back and forth between the function stack, your list of cognitive functions, and the 4 letter names. So for example, in my case, it's INTP. So going back and forth from one to the other. If you're interested, I made a video that explains how to do that. And then one last recommendation is that Personality Database is a website where basically you can type lots of characters. So either real life celebrities or fictional characters. And although, again, there's a lot of bad typing and bad arguments on there, it's still like a good source to practice your typing skills by reading some debates and maybe trying yourself to type people. And if you're just like watching a TV series or a movie and you're like, I wonder what this character's type might be, or reading a novel, that's like a good way to kind of get into thinking about it. So it kind of gives you some practice. And you could also check out forums and subreddits, and again, at your own risk, plenty of shoddy stuff out there. Once you feel pretty comfortable with the MBTI theory, and if you want to dip your toes into Socionics, the main Bible, so to speak, is a Wikisocian wiki website that kind of explains the whole theory. But I do find it pretty dry, and whenever I tried to learn Socionics, at first I'd go on the site and read descriptions, and it'd be a lot of information. I'd be a little bit lost, and I'd be like, okay, what's the point? How is this any better than the MBTI? Why should I put why should I put in all this effort? And I'd end up giving up after a while. But then I discovered Jack Aaron's exhaustive YouTube video series that does a great job of explaining every fundamentals of the system on his YouTube channel called World Socionics Community. I don't remember the exact name, but you'll find the link in the description. So that's what I would recommend. That was a very long video. I had a lot to say. But that about sums it up. If you enjoyed it, you might be interested in some of my previous videos. So as I mentioned, I did an overview on the Big Five, which is shorter than this one. And there's a video on should you trust personality typology or frameworks. I kind of list some of the pros and cons, and that will come back in all of these overviews. So if that's of any potential interest, you can check them out. In any case, thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of it, because this one was pretty long. And see you in the next video.